Evening, everybody. Thank you once again for joining us, and welcome back to a new season of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, a Sunday evening Zoom series. It's been 2 years since the passing of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, and needless to say, his passing has been a tremendous loss for the Jewish people. Rabbi Sachs had so many unparalleled gifts and talents. He knew how to inspire the masses. He knew how to reach the hearts of individuals who others were unable to touch. He had a true gift of connecting with people of so many different backgrounds and people from so many different worlds. There's truly no one like Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs was a dear friend of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. He would routinely visit, and it would always be one of the highlights of the year, of the programming year, when Rabbi Sachs would visit. The shul would always be packed. And of course, he would always inspire everybody. Now, Rabbi Sachs was also a prolific writer. He wrote many essays and books, and he also has many manuscripts that have not yet been published, that have not yet been completed. And there is an initiative to organize all his different writings in a very systematic fashion, and to reproduce them, and to publish that which has not yet been published. And one of the individuals who's involved in this important work is Rabbi Sachs's dear brother, younger brother, Alan Sachs, who lives in Yerushalayim. And it's a great honor for us to have Alan present for us this evening in honor and memory of some words of tribute for Rabbi Sachs upon the occasion of his second Yahrzeit.
Thank you, Rabbi. Alan, thank you so much. I know the hour is late in Israel. Alan, is your, I don't see your picture. Alan?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, you're back.
I'm here. I haven't left.
Okay, thank you so much for doing this for our community today on this important Yahrzeit. So you mentioned earlier that you've been to our synagogue before, but just for our congregation, if you could give maybe some background on yourself. We know you're Rabbi Sachs's second brother. We know you live in Israel. We know you're an attorney, but if you could talk a little bit about yourself, please, to our community. Thank you.
First of all, good evening to you. It's an honor, real honor to be here with your community. I'm not my brother's brother. Don't expect words of wisdom or great oratory. I'll do my best to answer your questions. I was, like my brother, I was born in London. I'm third of 4 boys. We all followed the same academic path. We went to the same non-Jewish public schools. We went to the same college at Cambridge. I studied law and qualified as a lawyer in England, and immediately after qualifying, with the generous support of my father-in-law, came to Jerusalem to study in yeshiva. And after a couple of years of that, and having gone back for our first child to be born, because we were essentially tourists still in Israel, I basically looked at my wife, and my wife looked at me, and we said to each other, why on earth are we going back to England? We have no children in school, we have no mortgage to pay off, we have no home. And so we decided to have a try at making a go of it in Israel. Israel in the early 80s was not the modern cosmopolitan Israel of today. It was far more developed than the Israel of 1948 in that sense, but it was still quite a sort of challenge to decide to give up a career in England and go to Israel. But year after year we continued. I suppose we're still trying it out after 41 years. It's undoubtedly, other than marrying Judith, the best decision I ever made in my life to go and live in Israel. I think my children turned us into Zionists. We have 6 children, who 5 boys and a girl, and they all the boys went into yeshiva and then into very elite combat units. And there have been no prouder moments. I think you asked me for a short bio, and I told you that my brother and my brother Jonathan and I both took great pride in what our children are doing. And along the way, I pursued a legal career, and that was incidental to raising a family in Jerusalem, which is one of the great joys of life.
So tell us, so when you moved to Israel, you said it was 1981. What year was that?
81.
81. So today, Israel is different than 81. The Aliyah movement is expanding rapidly. London has issues, the United States has issues, anti-Semitism's up. But can you talk about, have you seen dramatic changes from 1981 to today as far as being a lawyer in Israel? Have things changed dramatically? Like when you said in 81, it was a big decision to not go back to London. But today it seems like it's your decision is less dramatic than it was.
But decision today, listen, a decision today is a very different decision from that. And I'm not saying it was a bold decision. It was a decision which made itself, because living in Jerusalem is truly a gift. So it was not a hard decision to make. But in 1981, first of all, we have to go back in time. You're too young to remember this. When I started in the law office, there was no such thing as a word processor. Leave aside a fax machine or laptop computer. There was no internet. So we actually typed out documents on typewriters using carbon paper and sent contracts in the mail to New York and got back with comments 2 weeks later. It was an entirely different world. The Israeli economy was truly domestic, and any investment in Israel was essentially sentimental Jewish investment. Some of the major Jewish families were investing in Israel, the Bronfmans, the Safras, and families like that. But there was no international trade as such, no international commerce of any major significance. As things rolled on, we had the Madrid Peace Conference, which led to the dropping of the Arab boycott, which meant multinational companies were coming in because here was a new market, and so multinationals suddenly came in. And then there was the whole tech boom, where Israel proved itself to be a world leader, and this totally transformed the nature of the Israeli economy, which became from being very much a domestic backwater to being an international and very cosmopolitan arena. I was a special case when I came to start work in Israel, for the simple reason that I spoke English. Israeli lawyers couldn't deal with international contracts. They couldn't write such a thing. And today, for youngsters coming to Israel today, and I've got nephews who come to live in Tel Aviv, they work in high tech, they have great salaries, they have great living conditions, they have a cafe society. Tel Aviv, which used to be completely devoid of anything Jewish, is now buzzing with kosher restaurants, kosher cafes, very active minyanim. It's a place where people will upgrade to, rather than what would have been the opposite in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. So yes, Israel is a very different place. I mean, you could plug in from New York or San Francisco or London, and you could plug right into working in Israel. Now, I've been incredibly blessed in my career, because fortune or hashgacha pratit, or whatever you want to call it, has blessed me. I had as partners, law partners, at the beginning, Chaim Herzog, who of course was ambassador in the United Nations, then became president of the state, Yaakov Ne'eman, who was Minister of Finance, Minister of Justice, as law partner to our current president, Yitzhak Herzog. And so I did manage to meet, because where I was, I managed to meet with leading figures in the world of politics, in the world of business, it's been a very blessed time, a very blessed time.
Yeah, just because you mentioned Yaakov's name, so Yaakov Neman was a regular visitor at Fifth
I
Avenue
understand.
Synagogue.
Sure.
He was
Sure,
actually
sure.
at my wedding and very close to my in-laws, and he's probably one of the most respected people that attended our synagogue. So having a partner like him, remind me if I'm correct, but he used to take off the Sarah Smith Shuva to learn in yeshiva every year, if I
That's
recall.
correct. That's correct. He used to go to Othniel, Shiva, very close to my heart. And I know he was very close to many people at your shul. I know that, sure.
Yeah. So do you feel someone today going into law, it's not 1981, but if you wanted to, be a lawyer in Israel today, do you feel it's at the level of being in the United States or London, or you still think is it at par?
It depends what you mean by the level. I think that we work shoulder to shoulder. I would not claim to be, that our law firm is as professional and slick as the great New York law firms or the great London law firms, but we're working shoulder to shoulder with all the major New York firms and with the major London firms. So in terms of the quality of legal work, I think that a young person coming to live in Israel and wanting to build a career would not be disappointed working in one of the big Tel Aviv law firms. I don't think that at all. I don't think that the salaries are commensurate. On the other hand, the cost of living is not commensurate. I don't think that the cost of putting four or five children through day school is slightly different from Israel, where you don't actually have to pay for these schools. So you have to balance out these items. But as I say to every would-be immigrant, and many people have come to talk to me over the years, you're trading one quality of life for another. You have to want to come to live in Israel, and then if you want to come and live in Israel, you will, all things being equal and God willing, have just a wonderful lifestyle and a wonderful life, living a full Jewish life, an integrated Jewish life, inside and outside, in a way I think is unmatched in Chutz La'aretz. My brother agreed with me with me on that point entirely. He felt that living in Israel was living a full Jewish life in a way that you couldn't do in the diaspora. Very much so. Very much.
So talk about, you said your brother and you both went to Cambridge. I don't know the age difference, Rabbi Sachs.
We're 8 years different.
8 years different.
My brother's 8 years older than me.
So I assume your parents emphasized good education to have two kids in Cambridge. I mean, that wasn't probably common.
They actually had 4 children in Cambridge.
Okay, so that makes the question.
I don't think that my parents ever came to a parents' evening. They never checked our work. They never asked how we did. Somehow they instilled in us a certain set of values and a set of appreciations. And perhaps there's something genetic in there too, but no, my parents were very far from intellectual, and our home was not an intellectual home where conversation on matters of the day were discussed. Not at all, absolutely not. So it's a mystery to me.
So was it that your brother kind of led the path and then you guys followed him, or how do you
explain? Yeah, in that sense, the idea of, my brother was the first one in our family, among cousins, wider family. My first one in my family to go, not quite true. Some of my first cousins, he was the first one of our close family to go to university. And my father left school when he was 13. And my mother, not much older than that, but he was an intellectual, and as a teenager, he was very interested, much more interested in politics and debating and moral issues of the day than he was in sport, for example. So he led the way in the sense that he introduced us to the idea of what university was. It was, nothing. It was nothing in our family before then, and we all followed the same path, the same college in Cambridge.
So talk about it is your brother's Yahrzeit, and that's why we're doing the Zoom. So was your brother? Would you say? When did you realize there's an 8-year gap? The power of your brother, that he could do so much. Did that develop later in life, or did you see that at a young age from the facts?
Listen, it was clear to me as a young teenager that my brother, or even a younger, was very brilliant. And that didn't mean that he just had a massive knowledge or that he could remember things. All of that was true, but he had a brilliant way of explaining issues that were under discussion. He could analyze and explain clearly. He was a great debater, so he could put forward an argument very cogently, very clearly. He was a great speaker. None of this being in the Jewish world, but he was very, very smart, very good at he's at analytical thinking, very good at communication. That was clear early on, that he would become a rabbi or become a sort of global rabbinical figure. Or that came a lot later.
So talk about that, because we had a Zoom with your niece Gila last year, and from what Rabbi Sachs, I think he told our congregation, or we had private discussions, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a big impact on him when he came to New York. Tell us, is that true, or are we on the right path?
We're on the right path. I mean, it's a story which has been told many times. I think that this sort of his journey began before that. His journey began when he was at Cambridge around the time of the 6-Day War, which was a very vulnerable time for Jews around the world. There was a serious fear that Israel would actually be wiped off the map. And remember, the 60s was a time of self-fulfillment, self-identity. It was a time of, I won't say the hippies here, but people finding new identity, new identities, a religious awakening. And in the aftermath of this magnificent victory in the 6-Day War, Jews suddenly became far more self-confident and willing to show their Jewishness in public. In England, which is very much unlike New York, for example, the idea of seeing someone wearing a kippah in the street, unless you were hardcore Haredi in Stamford Hill, was just not heard of. I remember as a young boy, someone running after us to tell us that after shul, to tell us we'd forgotten to take off our kippot. Because that just wasn't for most people that wasn't done, and so people started wearing kippot, and my brother got into this at Cambridge and was clearly affected by it, and so were his contemporaries. And then the end of his second year at college, he went on a road trip. He was studying philosophy, and he was interested in speaking to the great rabbis of the day and asking them his various questions. And so he made this trip to the United States of America, and he spoke to rabbis here and rabbis there. He was clearly influenced intellectually by, or challenged intellectually by the late Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, whom we met. But he'd been sent to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Outreach was basically unheard of in the 1960s. It began in the 60s and began with Chabad. And Chabad used to send up rabbis to Cambridge. And the rabbis who went up to Cambridge from Chabad, from London, identified my brother as being a real star and a great potential for the future. And they told him, you have to go and see the Rebbe, you have to go and see the Rebbe. So he went to New York and came to Brooklyn and said, I would like to see the Rebbe. And they said, you're joking, you can't just walk in and see the Rebbe. And he said, well, I'm going to Los Angeles to see my aunt. And if there's a chance, this is her number, just call me. And if there's a chance, I would really appreciate seeing the Rebbe. And so he was in Los Angeles, and he gets a phone call there, and somebody says to him, if you're in New York on Thursday, the Rebbe will see you. And so, having $12 in his pocket or whatever, he did what people did in those days. He bought a Greyhound bus ticket and drove nonstop from Los Angeles to New York, and appeared at 770 Eastern Parkway and met the Rebbe. All of this, I'm simply paraphrasing his own story. At that meeting, something happened which hadn't happened in any of the other meetings. He asked his set of questions, which he'd asked all of the rabbis of the day, and then the Rebbe turned the table and did something that none of the other rabbis had done. He started asking my brother questions. How many Jews are there in Cambridge? 1,000. How many of them identify as Jews? Maybe 100 turn up to the Jewish Society. How many of them come to the synagogue service? Maybe 50. And how many of them come to the kosher meals? Maybe 30. And he says, well, what are you doing about this? And my brother said, in the situation I find myself in, and the Rebbe cut him short and said, you don't find yourself in a situation, you put yourself in a situation, and now's the time to put yourself in a different situation and start being an influence. And that clearly sowed a seed. He didn't drop everything and become a rabbi. He finished his law degree. He did outstandingly well. He completed his PhD in philosophy. He began teaching secular philosophy at university. He even enlisted to enroll to the bar school to become a lawyer. But something deep down inside him was nagging at him that he should be doing something for the Jewish people. And that message from the Rebbe kept beating in his heart. And at a relatively late stage, he decided that he had a massive bank of knowledge of Western culture, Western civilization, Western philosophy, psychology, sociology, you name it. He was pretty much of a polymath, but his Jewish knowledge was embarrassingly weak by comparison. So he shut himself away for close to 7 years and really did isolate himself and studied intensely until he had a great mastery of Torah, applying his...
Where did he study 7 years? I'm sorry, where was he studying those 7 years?
He was an autodidact. He basically he locked himself in a room, and he had, as a teacher, he had the great Torah scholar, the late Nachum Rabinovich, a Torah giant, who was my brother's true Torah teacher. But if truth be told, my brother was essentially an autodidact. He sat and studied by himself.
This is before Art Scroll, right? This is before you had Art Scroll in America?
Absolutely. Yes. He struggled. If you listen to some of his speeches, he talks about the struggle and getting out of your comfort zone, and it was a struggle, but as I say, he had massively brilliant, and he applied his knowledge and his critical and analytical skills to his study of Torah. And at the end of it, he had not only this huge body of knowledge of Western culture, he also had this huge body of Torah knowledge, and one didn't blank out the other. He didn't replace one with the other. He used them together. He synthesized them, always looking at the secular world through the lens of Torah, and always trying to, he uses the term engaged Judaism, always trying to use his Torah to view the world and try to understand the world through the lens of Torah and see the relevance of Torah to the issues, the contemporary issues of the day.
So two things you mentioned. So first of all, that's a major commitment. In other words, what do you remember? In other words, 7 years is not 1 year. So, I mean, what was it, a 7-year commitment from day one, or did it become 1 year?
I think he started studying from, he would be the first to admit, relatively low level, and eventually he took smicha with Rav Rabinovich, and he took smicha in Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in London with Rabbi Ordman, Zichrono Livracha. One day, I hope my sister-in-law still has his smicha certificate, because he got, let's just say, he got glowing commendations on his smicha. And then, presumably, when he was just over maybe 31, he took up his first. He began teaching at the same time at Jews College, and he took up his first rabbinical post. Presumably, I'm not sure about the exact date, so if I'm wrong, I apologize, but I think he must have been 31, maybe it was 1979, when he took up his first post in this shul in Golders Green.
Fascinating. So one thing you mentioned, which I always noticed, Rabbi Sachs was one of the most proud Jews that I have known, in the sense of he was very comfortable being in a secular crowd, wearing his yarmulke, very proud of who he was. So you mentioned at Cambridge, and I think you mentioned your family, he would wear his yarmulke after shul. I think you said someone once approached you and said, shul's over. Where do you think that inner confidence, inner happiness, is that something that came from your parents, or I mean, because that is something.
As I mentioned earlier, that ours was not in any sense a rabbinical home, but my brother certainly inherited some facets, some characteristics from my late father, and one of them was certainly a fierce pride in being Jewish. My father was fiercely proud of being Jewish, and many of the things. My brother had 3 photographs on his desk. Downstairs in his lounge, he had all of the vanity photos of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs with President Clinton, and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs with Queen Elizabeth, and Rabbi Sachs with all of these, and of course all of the family photos. On his desk, he had 3 photos. He had a photo of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, he had a photo of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he had a photo of our father.
Wow.
And those 3, in their fundamentally different ways, influenced my brother a great deal. Of course, he had his own value added on top of all of that, but those were 3 great influences. My father's pride in being Jewish, his dignity. My father regarded the term dignity or the idea of dignity. My brother always led his life with dignity. Doesn't matter what situation, the way he dressed, the way he behaved, his mannerisms, however much he may have been provoked. It was very, very, very important for him to behave in a dignified manner. And he took that from my father too. And we mentioned earlier, before this began, I think the love of music that we all have certainly came from our father.
Yeah. Because that's fascinating, because you don't hear that a lot. But from your father, he was very proud of his heritage and proud to be Jewish, and that gave him tremendous encouragement in going forward. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. But my question is, how did your, as a parent, and you're a parent and a grandparent, but how do you teach those values to your children? Like, how do you think that your father was able to give that over? It was just an authentic way of observing your dad? Did he talk about it? He was just a happy person? How do you think he was?
My father could be accused of many things, but I don't think he could be accused of being a happy person. My father was a very frustrated person. He was somebody who wanted to be an intellectual, would have wanted an education, but circumstances in London in the 1920s and 30s didn't allow him. And he was fiercely proud of the achievements of his children. He was fiercely proud of his children. Where did the dignity or the pride come from? We would all be dressed crisp, ready to walk, and we walked a long way to shul. He didn't want to go to the shuls nearby. My father always liked to daven in small shuls, in Stieblach. He always loved that. He didn't like big, ornate shuls at all. But we would always be dressed right, and we'd wear our shirts and ties, and we'd all walk off together to shul, and we'd behave just though, without ever lecturing. That's just the way it was. We weren't told to do this or that. It's just the way it was in our house.
So there's a certain dignity and a certain respect and reverence that your father, taught his children, to how to dress, how to behave, how to be proud. And like you said, you walked to the shul that he chose. So it wasn't based on convenience. It was based on
My father didn't believe in convenience. He also didn't believe in it. He believed in authenticity. He didn't believe absolutely in authenticity. He didn't believe in anything that was fake, artificial. He liked Stieblach because he found the tefillah to be sincere and authentic, much more than these large halls where people are, scattered from each other. I mean, I mentioned large halls. The first thing my brother did, he didn't do it too successfully, when he started in Golders Green Synagogue, which was a shul which on Friday night would have sat several hundred people, but there may have been 20 people there. And he tried to get all the people to sit together in the front two rows rather than be scattered around the hall. And it was a real battle, because people were saying, but I sat in the seat for 30 years, you can't make me move here. And there was a huge amount of opposition to his attempt at reforming the customs of this I don't know, ocean liner, this hanger of a shul. But slowly he did it. He got rid of canonical gowns. The rabbis used to wear these long gowns, and got rid of that, and slowly made these changes against plenty of opposition. But with the power of his oratory and the power of his intellect and his dealing closely with people, he slowly brought about those changes.
So you're saying a lot of very important things, but Rabbi Sachs clearly was a Kiddush Hashem always. He was clearly authentic, and sounds like from your childhood, there was a certain training, that he eventually took into the rabbinate. And you also said your brother was very articulate, which, a lot of people have a lot of knowledge, but they can't necessarily transfer that to the next generation. And your brother, which you'll talk more, but he really loved being around young people. I don't know, and he was very early with the internet, a lot of lectures online. I wonder if you could talk about that.
There are people who are better placed to talk to that issue. But my brother loved learning new things. He loved learning about technology. I'm not saying that he could take apart a computer and put it back together again, but he loved what technology could offer. And he understood very clearly the power of the media, and that he could reach audiences. It's one thing in the 1980s speaking to 50 people at the shul on Shabbos morning, or 200 people on Shabbos morning, but being able to reach an entire country by broadcasting on the BBC, which predated, his BBC broadcasts predated, or his fame or his renown on the internet. But he realized that using the newspaper articles where he was writing for the Times, using BBC for messages, these were ways of reaching far wider audiences. And you call it a Kiddush Hashem. The idea is that if he could be out there in the public space as a rabbi, as a Jewish leader, influencing the whole of English society, then that in itself is a Kiddush Hashem, which would make many people proud of being Jewish. So long before the internet, there's a famous slot on the BBC in the morning, Thought for the Day, where a thinker is asked to say something before the 8 a.m. news. It's very, very well known in the UK. In the London Times, there are articles on belief. As I say, as chief rabbi, he was giving TV programs on. He wasn't just giving sort of narrow-minded, a lesson on the Torah Parsha of the week. He was speaking about major social and moral issues around the globe. It may have been from the Bosnian War. He was reporting about what people need to be doing and how the Jewish community was helping and so on. So he was using these formats, these media, to get to a much, much, much wider audience. And then, of course, in the early 2000s, when the internet suddenly exploded onto the scene, he loved doing that, and he loved his talks on YouTube, appearing on YouTube, and he loved his whiteboard animations, and he saw all of these as tools to reach. How many people would you reach if you handed out a weekly pamphlet in shul? You're not going to reach many people, but if you can put it out on the internet, Covenant and Conversation, you'll reach 50,000 or however many people, 50,000 households, maybe more. I don't know. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but you reach an extraordinary audience. When my brother died, the family received letters, emails, an outpouring of commiseration from New Zealand, from Baptists in Tennessee, from Palo Alto, across the entire globe, because he'd reached all these people using this technology.
Yeah. So I said this, I think, on the Zoom on the first Yahrzeit with Gila, your niece, but I had the privilege of going with your brother. We spent a few Pesachs together. But one of our trips with Lady Sachs and the family was to the St. Regis in Laguna Beach. So I was involved in arranging his travel, etc. And Rabbi Sachs, comes over to me and said, he needs to stay for another day. So I said, sure, Rabbi, you want to relax, you want to stay another day. He says, no, it's not to relax. He said, Google has invited me to speak to the whole company. The HR department found out I was here. He said, I wouldn't ask you to change the ticket for me. This is Google wants me to. But, it was amazing that he, Google would invite your brother, they heard he was in California to speak to their employees. So that, I'm just expounding on what you're saying, but he found a way to.
What I consider to be great is the fact that he always did it as an Orthodox rabbi. He didn't do it as a thinker or an advisor to kings or princes or prime ministers. He always did it as an Orthodox rabbi. Always, without any apology, as an Orthodox rabbi. And he proved that you can hold your head up, not make any compromise at all, and yet be invited to speak in the European Parliament, to sit with the Queen, or now the as he then was the Prince in Windsor Castle, or meet Angela Merkel, or meet the President of the United States of America as a rabbi, as a proud rabbi.
Right. So that was another thing I wanted to touch on this evening. So it seems like your brother, and again, you're biased and I'm probably biased, but you know better. But, an Orthodox Jew had such a profound impact on so many secular Jews and even non-Jews. In other words, your brother really touched so many people throughout the broader Jewish community, and he touched so many people that weren't Jewish. And I was curious, do you think that was like a planned process, or you think it was just because he was so authentic and so real, and you know, he had a unique confidence and he was so articulate? But why do you think that he, you know, had such a profound impact on so many secular Jews, so many non-Jews? And, you know, it doesn't seem like there are that many rabbis that can pull off what your brother pulled off.
In an age of religious skepticism, in an age where people are unhappy much of the time, my brother was an authentic voice of faith. And I actually had dinner on this Friday night. I was invited, and among the guests was a lady who was leading a Catholic mission, a Catholic pilgrimage, a lady from England who was leading her church. And when she found out that my brother was Jonathan Sacks, she said, "Oh, Rabbi Sacks, I used to listen to him all the time on the radio. What an inspirational voice." Because he was speaking in the voice of his God, but he was never deprecating, never dismissing any other faith organization. He was encouraging faith and encouraging the behavior that faith inspires. And so whether you believe in God or in reaching God through one path or another, that was not his concern. He believed that belief in God was the bedrock of the proper moral behavior, and people were attracted to that. He was never condescending to other religions. He was never insulting to other religions. As I say, he spoke with dignity, great deal of humor, and humor disarms. And so, you know, he encountered very, very little hostility, except sometimes from the Jewish community. Another story for another day, maybe. And that's why he was so popular, because he became the moral voice of the nation in England, for sure. And when any big issue of the day, and it could be an issue of Brexit or other issues of the day, when they wanted a moral voice talking about how British society, some ways similar to a US society in recent years, was tearing itself apart over this issue of Brexit, and they wanted a moral voice, they didn't go to the Archbishop of Canterbury or to the Cardinal of Westminster, they went to the moral voice of the nation, because he was speaking about God and faith and kindness to each other. And, you know, my brother had many definitions of faith, but, you know, one of his much repeated definitions was seeing the face of God in your fellow man. God made every man, woman, person in his image, and that applies to everybody. That applies unequivocally, as far as my brother's concerned, to Jews and non-Jews alike. And therefore, there was no hostility. On the contrary, they would say, here is somebody who's telling us to believe in what we believe in, be decent human beings, love our neighbor as ourselves, do good deeds. And that, as I say, was what appealed to him in a way he didn't do it in as simplistic a way as I did. And of course, you know, when there were major moral or psychological issues of the day, he would see them through the lens of the Torah. And again, people would say, oh, it's not such a new problem. It's not such a new issue. If you can go back to the Bible, you'll find these issues being considered. They had problems in the family. Avram had problems in his family, and Yitzhak had problems with his family, and Yaakov had problems. So family problems are not anything brand new. Rebel children, you name it. So he was very much engaged. As I say, I mentioned his term was engaged Judaism. His Judaism was totally relevant to the modern world. In the introduction to my brother's last or latest publication here, President Herzog wrote the introduction, and he used the line that Rabbi Sachs brought the Torah down from heaven to the smartphone generation.
Sure, but maybe the education at Cambridge, because he was, once he went to Cambridge and he was educated, maybe he felt comfortable, with secular people, with non-Jews, because he had already, like you, experienced that environment. So it wasn't as insulated.
Of course. I mean, if he'd have gone to yeshiva for 5 years, then he would never have turned out as Jonathan Sachs. But
Right.
He did have, his breadth of knowledge was extraordinary. I mean, he would have discussions with experts on art, or experts on politics, or experts on economics, or experts on psychology, and he'd just be able to answer these people at their level of understanding. Because one of the things that accompanied him through his life was an overwhelming knowledge to learn, yearning to learn. He read a book a day on the widest array of subjects you could imagine. He sought out the best people to learn subjects from in whatever area of investigation he wanted to write about or was being asked to speak about. So he knew so many things in so many areas so well, and could look at all those all through his Jewish lens.
Would you say your brother was always the eternal optimist?
No. Oh, and yes. Well, he did nothing but encourage people. He did nothing but encourage people. Did he have his moments of despair? Did he have his depressions? Yeah, I don't think you could go through a career like that of 40 years not having your moments of despair. And he did have his moments of despair, but they were very, very, very private. He was encouraging in every direction. He was, and you'll hear this from hundreds, thousands of people, how he encouraged them and mentored them and told them to do more and do this and do that and think about different ways. He answered, I mean, the number of people who wrote to him for advice, and he would answer them, and always in an upbeat way. And you always saw him upbeat. There he had his moments. He had his black moments. I don't think he was a human being. We shouldn't ever forget that. He was a human being, and he on occasion made mistakes, and he admitted he made mistakes. He wasn't infallible either. But being positive was absolutely, he was positive in everything he did in his profession as rabbi, communal leader, philosopher, theologian, moral voice, ambassador for Israel, ambassador for the Jewish people, you name it. He was always positive.
So let's talk about the music part, because when your late brother came to Fifth Avenue, you wouldn't know the music part of him unless you actually saw it. So first of all, he came for Rosh Hashanah. He wanted to do Psukei de Zimra, which was beautiful, hearing him daven. That wasn't expected, but he pushed himself to do that, and it was really special. And I remember at a Friday night dinner, he got up on the chair, and he sang with Ruach, and he liked Kalbach, and I don't know if the public knew that part of him, and I'm curious, was that music in his childhood with you, or if you can talk about that a little bit.
My father was a great lover of music. He made us suffer. When you're 11 years old, you don't want to listen to Mahler symphonies. You'd much rather listen to the Beatles. And so we listened to Beatles and the Mahler symphonies. And he, of course, was a great lover of music. He made us suffer. When you're 11 years old, you don't want to listen to Mahler symphonies. You'd much rather listen to the Beatles and the Mahler symphonies. And so we listened to Beatles and the Mahler symphonies. it was always part of our life. When my brother went to Cambridge, became more sophisticated. His tastes became more sophisticated. He always says that's where he discovered the Beethoven quartets, which he regarded as the most spiritual of all music. We always sang Zmirot at Shabbat table. It wouldn't be a surprise that Rabbi Sachs would be interested in music. It would be a surprise that he stood on a chair and waved his arms and encouraged people. But that was Rabbi Sachs when he'd taken his jacket off and was feeling, in the mood. He understood very well the power of a nigun. He understood that a nigun could express emotion that words can't express. And there was that spiritual Hasidic side of him, which never left him. So he regarded music as an incredibly powerful medium for expressing emotion in a way that words can't. But he also loved, as I say, he loved classical music and knew classical music well. And he loved the Beatles. We used to speak a great deal about the Beatles, and he loved keeping up to date with contemporary music. I have correspondence somewhere downstairs in my house about Eminem and the violence of Eminem. And he loved Hamilton. He thought Hamilton was one of the most wonderful things he'd ever seen in his life. He thought it was a work of absolute genius. There's a weekly paper. It's the national religious weekly paper called Commemoration here, and it appears on a weekly basis. And there's a magazine, and an inside back page. There's a culture each week. There's an individual, and he's asked for his cultural references and his heroes and all the rest of it. And people are asked, with whom would you like to spend a day? Or with whom would you like to have a cup of coffee? And the answers are usually, might be Theodore Herzl or the Rambam or Ben Gurion. My brother wrote Lin-Manuel Miranda because he thought this ability to take a piece of pretty obscure American history and make it so attractive and appealing and modern was a work of genius. It's the way Lahavdil Elef Havdalot, he wanted to take the Torah and make it fresh, keen, and accessible without adulterating or watering it down in any way. So his love of music was, great. We used to send each other film clips. Have you seen this? Have you listened to this? Have you heard that? Have you heard this? Have you heard that? Yeah. That was one of our great methods of communication with my brother and myself.
So one thing you mentioned earlier, which is fascinating. So when after Cambridge, when he wanted to really delve in learning, so you said, I think, Nachum Rabinowitz, but he went and pursued these great rabbis that he knew in London to study with him kind of one-on-one. In other words, he could have gone to Israel, checked in a yeshiva. I'm just trying to, go back in time.
That wasn't my brother's way, and it wasn't his temperament. It was all going on in his head. I don't think he could have taken the idea, the pace, the frustrations to an extent of arguing with the Chavrusa. He would remember he had a PhD in philosophy. He was one of perhaps England's most brilliant young philosopher. And to go and join 18-year-olds in Gateshead or in Beer or somewhere else,
right?
That was not his way. He drove himself and taught himself using his intellect and his critical faculties, and then with guidance from these great Torah scholars in London. And I think you can see, the outcome speaks for itself. He knew how to study. He knew how to analyze. He knew. One of the things that he wrote this isn't directly relevant to your question, but I think in some ways it is. He began, I don't know how many, 15 years ago, more, 16 years ago, however many years ago it was, he began his Covenant and Conversation weekly Torah commentary. And he wrote in the introduction that he wants to look at the parsha not through a microscope, but through a telescope. He wants to see a big picture. He wants to understand the whole vision rather than take some minor fragment and study it in minute detail. And without wishing to criticize the yeshiva system, and I studied in a pretty reputable yeshiva in Jerusalem, the emphasis is placed on microscopic detail without seeing the big picture. And the idea of actually learning an entire Masechta, you may sit for 4 or 5 months of Wintersman learning Masechet Gittin or Erevin and never understand what a get is. So my brother was very much wanting to understand the picture, the big picture, and see the whole picture, and then narrow in.
Interesting.
To the detail and understand the principles, the philosophical rationale. And that's where he studied his Gemara, and of course, some of the Achronim in particular, he followed that approach, and that was his way. And learning Nichavuta would not have been his way.
I understand. Tell us when did the writing start? Was that because he has a chumash, and you'll tell us what you're doing in the legacy. But when did the writing, was that 20 years ago or even sooner?
No, it's longer ago than that. He promised himself, and I may get my dates wrong, he promised himself that he had to write a book by the age of 40.
Okay.
So he was writing articles here, but his first book, he brought out his first book when he was 40. It then picked up pace. He used to, his habit was to close himself off. When he was chief rabbi, it was the same. He would close himself off for 2 months in a year. Couldn't interrupt him, couldn't interfere with him. Very, very rarely appeared. And he would come out at the end of the 2 months with another book. So every single year he brought out a book. And that's how he managed to produce 35 books in his lifetime, leaving aside all of the Torah commentaries he was writing on an ongoing basis. So he was writing his Covenant and Conversation, and he was writing speeches and lecturing in the most eclectic venues and in different countries. But every year, two months a year set aside exclusively for writing, and out came a book.
So 35 books, but when did the Siddur, he had the Machzor, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, he had those came later on, right?
Those came later on. I can't tell you exactly the date. If I go to the shelf, I can pull it off. But first of all, there had been an English Siddur called the Singer's Prayer Book, which had been the traditional English prayer book. And time had come for a commentary, and so my brother began by writing a commentary on the Siddur, which was basically for the English community. He then, maybe I have some small part of credit. I believe I introduced him at my son's bar mitzvah to a wonderful human being by the name of Matthew Miller of Koren Publishing House. And Koren since then has been publishing the Machzorim, came one after another, and for not just for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but for all of the Chagim. And he did start work, but only managed relatively small amount of a commentary on the Torah before he died. Unfortunately, he worked on a translation of the Torah, but then a New English translation. But his commentary was still in its very early stages when he fell sick. So, the writing of the books, that we know that this entire bookshelf full began really when he was around 40 years old, and then was more or less one a year. And Covenant and Conversation was in parallel to that, and that was an exercise. It came out every week for 15, however many years. And the Siddur and the Machzorim were also intense works of labor. I have to say, I haven't mentioned this, but as you can imagine, my brother was highly disciplined in his work ethic. Highly disciplined. He studied issues. First of all, his work ethic was intense, and he studied issues. He was never willing to speak on a subject without very seriously studying the subject. And that may be a subject way removed from the world of Torah. He may be asked to speak about child welfare or about economic policy, as he was, but he would study seriously and want to learn from the very best in the field before he would venture to speak on a subject.
Fascinating. So tell us, because I know you're working on the Rabbi Sachs legacy, but the work that he did on the I guess the Chumash or the Torah, so you said he was very early. So what's the plan to share that with others, or what's the vision?
The work, there was the work that he did himself in terms of the commentary, and where it has to be supplemented, the work will be essentially taken. Among others, my niece here in Israel is working very hard on the project. I mean, although Rabbi Sachs didn't write a commentary for this purpose per se, he did write a great deal on every single parsha. So the issue is to take what Rabbi Sachs wrote and put it in the right order, in the right manner, so that the Chumash could be brought out with the authentic Rabbi Sachs commentary on it. One thing the family do not want is something to be written in the name of Rabbi Sachs, which he did not actually write. There won't be in the spirit of or anything like that. What will be brought out will be a commentary on the Torah, and it will be what Rabbi Sachs wrote, but it's an exercise to take his entire lexicon of writing and speaking and prepare it in a way that can be produced as a commentary on the Torah.
Is there anything else maybe you can share with the participants? So as far as the legacy, I'm sure there's a lot online. There's a lot of books.
But the legacy is thinking, beyond that. Rabbi Sachs isn't here, but he left a legacy of teaching, of thought, of engaged Judaism at a time when Jews are disappearing, where religion is no longer in fashion, and where in Israel religion is a very hot subject. Israel is very, very divided between those who are extremely orthodox and those who have no affinity to religion whatsoever, zero. And so the legacy, it's taken us a while to formulate our plans, but we have two main pillars, let's say, of what we're working on now, and we are quite well developed in our planning. The first is education, and we want to reach Jewish day schools throughout North America, Jewish schools throughout Israel, and then those are the two major communities, but also the other communities around the world. And that means preparing curriculum material for teachers, presenting material with Rabbi Sachs's ideas in video form, in the latest, using the latest educational techniques in order to reach Jewish children, Jewish students on campus. Israel is in some ways very similar, but some ways very different from the United States of America. As I say, you would be surprised how many Jewish children have never been to Jerusalem. I think you'd be stunned to hear how many Jewish children have never been to Jerusalem and how much Judaism does not mean anything to them. They are You can be a Jewish American, you can't be a Jewish Israeli. That's an oxymoron. You are an Israeli. And they just don't have, many Jews here do not have any Jewishness at all. So we want to get Jewish ideas into the school system here, Jewish principles, Jewish values, and Rabbi Sachs has just got the best material available for doing that. So we're working very hard on that educational piece for formal education in high schools, informal education for youth movements, free army, colleges are a turning point in young boys and girls' lives, where they're looking for themselves, and the mechinot, the pre-army colleges, are very keen to take Rabbi Sachs. In the army education corps are very keen to take Rabbi Sachs's ideas, but we have to take it and mold it and produce it in a format which is, I don't know what the TikTok generation is. Believe me, I've never watched TikTok, but we have to produce it in a format which kids are going to want. You can't just throw them another book and say, learn this. That's not going to catch on. The second one is the whole idea of leadership, communal leadership, Jewish organizational leadership, rabbinical leadership, and trying to create a cadre of leaders who will teach and speak and encourage in the spirit of Rabbi Sachs. So that is that's another heavyweight project.
Okay.
And we're speaking to different organizations who may be about to take significant part have partnerships in that and in the educational field. So yes, there is a body of work which needs to be translated to Hebrew. Israelis don't really know Rabbi Sachs. They don't know Rabbi Sachs in the way that in the way that the American community knows Rabbi Sachs. It's ridiculous, but they don't, because the material hasn't been available in Hebrew. So we're translating to Hebrew, but then we have to translate it to Russian, have to translate it to Spanish, have to translate it to Portuguese. All of these are big standalone projects to get Rabbi Sachs out there. But on top of that, let's say we have to produce new Rabbi Sachs material for schools, for campuses, to deal with anti-Semitism on campus. All of these issues are the issues which the legacy is working on.
Great. So look forward to hopefully on a visit to New York, you'll come back as you work on these legacy projects with Joanna and the team, and share more with our community. So I want to invite Rabbi Babbage to come on if he wants to add anything. And Alan, it was really a pleasure. I feel like I learned so much tonight. I know the viewers did also. So if the rabbi wants to come back, I'll invite him now.
I give him one free question.
Okay.
Yes, Alan, thank you so much for this your description of your very influential brother. You really gave us a lot of insight. I think you did a very thorough job as well. Just one final question before we conclude, and you did touch on this. As a rabbi, and especially a chief rabbi, a person is always quote unquote on, always has to be concerned about that public image and the how people are viewing them. So maybe if you could perhaps touch a little bit upon who Rabbi Sachs was when he put his guard down with the family, maybe some of the challenges he had in his life, some of the struggles that he had in his career. Again, there's a public persona and there's a private persona. You can just share a little bit about his private personality.
First of all, Rabbi Sachs, you saw him in his last years a liberated Rabbi Sachs. I'm not answering your question quite yet, but when he left the role of chief rabbi, he took his jacket off metaphorically. He never took it off really, but metaphorically he took his jacket off and became far, far lighter and easygoing and less formal and less rigid. And so when he became this global religious star, and I don't mean that in a flippant way, but when he became a rock star, this was really after he took off the mantle of chief rabbinate, where dignity and formality was really part of the Anglo-Jewish community. I know he loved the freedom that he had in America to be far more outgoing and flamboyant, and which wasn't his natural way, by the way. I mean, he had to work on that a great deal. In private, he was a guy who was incredibly warm. You know, I would drop in and we would sit and chat about, would have been about music or about movies or about, and it would all somehow tie in with religion. He'd always want to know what's going on in Israel, and he, you know, I'd be one of his windows into Israel. One of his questions was always, what should I be doing next? What should I be doing next? But he enjoyed many normal things. He loved walking. He loved going for walks. That's one of his great passions, going for walks on Hampstead Heath. Although I did ask him once when in Israel, if we were going to go for a walk, I asked him, Jonathan, do you have a T-shirt? And he looked at me with, you know, raised with arched eyebrows. You know, a T-shirt? Of course not. So he loved gadgets. He loved his noise cancelling headphones. He regarded those as his most religious objects he had, because they cut out all the noise. He only heard the music, and he thought that was true religion, just hearing the music beneath the noise. Encouraging of people all the time, always positive. Very, very, very rarely angry, and I never in my whole life, and I'm not exaggerating, heard him speak Lashon Hara. Never. To an extent that sometimes I thought he was naive in speaking with people or speaking about people who were not necessarily worthy of being given the doubt, but he always saw the good side of people. He always saw the good side of people, and that was really one of his fundamental religious principles. Giving compliments to people, he writes about that often. Always seeing the good in people and wanting the good for people, helping out people. And of course, one of the things that separated Rabbi Sachs from every single rabbi I know is that never did he miss an opportunity to say, and my wife Elaine. In the Haredi world, of course, rabbis don't have wives with names. It's Rabbi this, V'rayato, and his wife. They don't actually have names on the invitation. My brother never missed an opportunity to say, and I owe everything to my wife Elaine. He put her on a pedestal. He loved his grandchildren. He encouraged his children to be their independent human beings and not live in his shadow. He was just, you know, for me personally, he was an inspiration to be close to someone who was such a fine thinking human being. I won't tell you that he hit me as a little boy. I'll leave all of that out. I'll leave all of that out of the equation. He didn't. But, you know, as I say, he was giving and supportive and encouraging all the time. And he liked to chill out, and he liked a cup of tea, and he liked a cup of coffee, and he occasionally liked some good wine and a glass of whiskey. Never lost control. We discussed books, movies. He'd give me books. He'd take this book, and I'd always leave whenever I'd visit, because, you know, I lived in Israel and I'd come and visit him every so often. He'd give me half a dozen books, and they all had pencil underlining, which showed he'd read them all and he'd underlined them, and he could probably tell you the page where he'd underlined, because he had this memory for these things. He had this sort of, wherever he lived, he had his Gan Eden. He had, you know, a separate part of the house which was full of thousands of books, and his desk and his computer. He did all, you know, he typed at great speed himself, and he did his research himself. His work ethic, as I said before, was extraordinary. But he loved mixing with people. He loved Shabbat in shul. He said, I think it was said at his. Actually, I reminded myself of something I have to do tomorrow. He said that someone mentioned his funeral. he said that if he'd had his way in shul, he would have been the man who handed out the candies, not the rabbi. So tomorrow I promised I'd go in Jerusalem. There is a new junior school called the Rabbi Sachs School, and I promised them I'd go and take them all candies after Tefillah. So I have to go tomorrow morning and take 150 krembo. And if you know what krembo are, that's probably a crime against humanity. But nevertheless, I'm sure they'll survive.
So Alan, this is really great, and intimate to share with on Rabbi Sachs's Yahrzeit with our community, and I look forward to you visiting our newly renovated synagogue. Hopefully,
Please God soon.
Yeah, and I know it's late, and I'm just very grateful on behalf of our community for your time and your insight and really teaching us so much about such a great person on his Yahrzeit, and it's just very impactful.
It's been a pleasure, and I promise you, every time I talk about my brother, I feel him here with me. So it's been for me a joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Only something. Have a good
Good
night.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.